But in lesson 1, we mostly just talked about the background, the setting, the arguments that people have about what time the Exodus may have actually taken place according to the various dynasties in Egypt. But mostly we saw all the important themes in the book of Genesis, which are the important theological background to the book of Exodus. And we looked a little bit at the first part of chapter 1, but we're going to go back, we're going to see that again a little bit to catch up and and get our set and get the setting. So to capture the setting here, I want to turn back to Genesis chapter 50 and just look at verses 22 and then 24 through 26. So Joseph remained in Egypt, he and his father's house. Joseph lived 110 years. Then skipping ahead to verse 24, and Joseph said to his brothers, I am about to die, but God will visit you and bring you up out of this land, to the land that he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Then Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here. So Joseph died, being 110 years old. They embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. So we see there that Joseph remembers the promises of God to Abraham, which we reviewed last week, and shows complete faith that God will fulfill those going forward. That his last comments to his family were the importance of holding on in faith to the promises that God had made. And then we go across to Exodus chapter 1 in verse 6. This is repeated. Then Joseph died, and all of his brothers, and all that generation. But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied, grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. There's a connection between all the things that happened in Genesis, all the emphasis on the promises to Abraham, and now the book of Exodus. But before we look more at what actually happens in the book of Exodus, I want you to go back and look at a couple verses in Genesis again, and I put them on the handout there for you under the heading of compare. So compare these statements that we see in the book of Genesis in chapter 1, 27. And 28, so God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them, and God blessed them. And God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, to have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the heavens, over every living thing that moves on the earth. And again in Genesis 17, verses 1 and 2, and then verse 6. When Abraham was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, I am God Almighty, walk before me and be blameless, that I may make my covenant between me and you, and may multiply you greatly. Going down to verse 6, I will make you exceedingly fruitful, I will make you into nations, and kings shall come from you. And then skipping ahead again to Genesis 35 in verse 10. And God is speaking to Jacob now. And God said to him, your name is Jacob. No longer shall your name be called Jacob, but Israel shall be your name. So he called his name Israel. And God said to him, I am God Almighty, be fruitful and multiply. A nation and a company of nations shall come from you, and kings shall come from your own body. We have that as one of the first things that we ever have in connection of God and man, be fruitful and multiply, spread dominion over the earth, then we see that become part of God's promise of blessings to Abraham, and then repeated to Jacob, you will be fruitful, and your descendants will multiply throughout the land. And then again, back in Exodus, the verse that we just looked at, the opening context of Exodus, chapter 1, verse 7, but the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. So the immediate context of the story jumps from the whole miraculous context of Joseph's life, bringing the people to Egypt, to God fulfilling the promise to Abraham and repeated to Jacob that he would be fruitful and multiply, which reflects all the way back to God's original plan for humanity to be fruitful and to multiply. So that's our immediate context here in the beginning of Exodus. Now let's let's read the story from verse 8 through 21. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. He said to his people, behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. So they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves, and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and bricks, and all kinds of work in the field. In all their work they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. Then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah, and the other Puah, when you serve as midwife to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him, but if it is a daughter, she shall live. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. So the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, why have you done this? And let the male children live. The midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them. So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. So we have the oppression of God's people. Our immediate context is God beginning this fulfillment of all of the promises, at least as it concerns the promise of offspring. I suppose if we're pretending or really are coming to this story for the first time, we can see, here he's beginning to fulfill the promise of the offspring, but what is this with forgetting about the promise of the land? What are they doing over here, being oppressed while they're multiplying? But we know that God has plans for that. What is interesting in the oppression story, Pharaoh says, let's deal shrewdly with them so that they don't multiply. And what's the result of all of his efforts? The more they're oppressed, the more they multiply. Which goes to show, we see throughout this story, right, the parts we've read and the parts we know about that are still to come, that once again, God is turning what was meant for evil to serve his own purposes. Right, Joseph said that about the machinations of his brothers against him. But it's screaming to us from behind the scenes here in this text, right? No matter what Pharaoh tries to do, instead, God brings about the fruitfulness and multiplying of his people.
You have to wonder and kind of think about the amount of faith that the Israelite people would have at that time to still have and to be fruitful and multiply, even though they know the Pharaoh
That's right. There are some interesting questions about the faith of the people of Israel throughout all of this. And we have kind of reflections on both sides of the coin, so to speak. But they certainly had to have had this, a constant vision of themselves as a people to continue on being fruitful and multiplying under these circumstances. And of course, we know that it brings some of them, closer to God. We know actually that is pretty much always the case. Right? That oppression is what brings some people closer in faith to God, because it allows you to realize that you can't really rely on yourself. Unfortunately, it also drives some other people away from God. I don't want to follow a God that allows these kind of things to happen. Is sometimes the human response. So all of Pharaoh's attempts to thwart God's plan fail, of course, illustrating one of the great themes of the book of Exodus, which is, of course, the sovereignty of God, working out his will and his plan in the world. Slavery is an important theme here that's established right away with the oppression of the people and making them work. It's a really important theme in the story because, like Romans in chapters 1 through 3, the appearance of a deliverer is not really quite so dramatic unless you set the stage for the need for deliverance. Right? That's how you understand the importance of the deliverer, is by being shown the need for delivery. I say it's not so dramatic, and I want to really emphasize that point here today, that this is a dramatic story. That right here from the beginning, I want to encourage you to look at it that way. As a dramatic story, being told on purpose with themes that are dramatic themes. Not because it isn't true, but because God has designed it that way. I mentioned this last week as well. This is a dramatic story. It is, in some senses, a great big long parable. Now, most parables aren't dramatic stories, and most dramatic stories aren't parables, but nonetheless, this is both a dramatic story and a parable. It's just that instead of telling a story as a parable, as Jesus did in so many occasions, God is writing the parable in the very history of the world. But it is no less a parable written on purpose to illustrate these themes for us. Let me illustrate for you the essential components of a dramatic story, according to Google AI. A compelling plot with action, relatable characters, high-stakes conflict, a defined setting, a core theme, and all of that should be tied together when it's driven by a protagonist and inciting incident, and builds through rising action to a climax, reversal of fortune, and resolution, creating emotional engagement. Are there any of those things which are not essential parts of the story that we have here in Exodus? A compelling plot with relatable characters, right? We actually see that all through all of the stories in the Old Testament, right? Relatable characters, not people without flaws, people that you can relate to. The things that happen in their lives. High stakes conflict, certainly. We know that that's happening. Defined setting. What could be more defined and interesting as a setting than what has already been laid before us with the powerful nation of Egypt and the whole context of pharaohs and enslaved people? Like core theme, which of course we have just illustrated, God's sovereign working in the world to fulfill the promises that he has made to Abraham, not to mention delivery from slavery, and that whole other page of themes, which I gave for you, so you can look at those on your own. Driven by a protagonist, this whole story about Moses and what he is doing, with an inciting incident, there's many options for that. Building through rising action to the climax of the death of the firstborn and the dramatic fleeing of from the nation to the ultimate reversal of fortune of going from being the enslaved people to being the people of God, out from the land, having their covenant established with the law. It is a dramatic story with all the elements of a dramatic story, and I just want to encourage you to think of it that way. That God is writing this drama for you in the history of the world and saving it for us so that we can continue to learn and appreciate the themes that we see in that. So, if we're going to think of it as a dramatic story, I have a cast list for you. Characters in Act 1. Characters in Act 1. We've got two pharaohs, unnamed, which is in and of itself interesting because we have whole lists of the names of pharaohs and they have their names plastered all over their tombs and all that kind of stuff. We know that about pharaohs of Egypt, but here we have King of Egypt, new King of Egypt. That's it. That's all you get to know about them. We have the people of Israel, and just kind of in general, the background players. We have two midwives who are specifically named. We have coming up, we haven't read this section yet, but we have coming up a Levite couple. Also, interestingly, not named. We know their names, but only because they're named later in the story when it talks about the lineage of Moses. Here in Act 1, they're just a Levite couple. We have the Pharaoh's daughter, unnamed, in the story. There are all kinds of traditions, Jewish traditions and other historical traditions that try to assign a name. But as far as the text is concerned, no name. And then, of course, we have Pharaoh. Moses, who is only going to be a little bitty baby for the purposes of Act 1. But this is an interesting element of Act 1, that the only people that get names in Act 1 are the midwives. Why do you suppose that only the midwives get names in Act 1, besides Moses right at the end of what I'm calling Act 1 anyway? There's no director's notes here. I just decided to call it Act 1. Yes?
Because the midwives are more more character in that area. The other ones are not around yet.
All right, so some other people we haven't even seen in the story yet, but even when we do, we're going to see them without names. We're going to be told a Levite married another Levite and they had a child. And his sister, I think I may have left that one out when I was listening to characters. The sister of Moses, also with no name. You know, we know her name is Miriam, but only because much later in the story we find out that her name is Miriam. Here in Act 1, it's just sister of Moses. A Levite's wife, a sister of Moses, some unnamed kings, and Shifra and Pua, the Hebrew midwives. They're the only ones. Yes.
I think the midwives are worthy of commendation right now, of praise. And so when they defied Pharaoh, they found a way to let the male babies be born, and that's important.
Right? There's a whole overturning of the appearance of what is great and important with what is actually great and important. We have this in the story, which of course we have frequently in God's economy of things, right? The all-important divine kings of Egypt get almost kind of a little footnote. Yeah, a king who didn't know Joseph. The king who was afraid of the growth of the Israelites. But these two, the ones who risked their lives to do what was right, they get remembered throughout all of history in this story by name. And I don't know if you don't study this kind of thing from the point of view of an academic at all, which, there's no reason why you would, but then you don't understand how much time and effort people have spent, continue to spend, and undoubtedly will continue until the end of the world to spend, trying to figure out exactly when these things happened, because the pharaohs aren't named. If the pharaohs were named, then we would know exactly when in the scheme of things these happened. But the pharaohs are not worthy of that much importance in the story, because they're just they're the futile enemies of God's plan.
Is there any explanation by the scholars why there's not more talked about the Israelites in Egyptian history, like in their own history?
Yes, there's two good reasons why it makes perfectly good sense that we don't hear about the Hebrews being in Egypt in the Egyptian history. One, because they called all of the peoples that they brought in, especially the ones that were looked down as slaves, Asians. And there's no reason why they would make a distinction in that regard for any historical footnote for these people. And two, the only things that are going to be preserved for the most part down through this time are the things that were purposely etched into stone. And guess which things were purposely etched into stone?
Good stuff.
The things that the pharaohs said, this is what I want it to be commemorated by. And which pharaoh says, here's what I want you to commemorate. It's my father got totally wiped out and drowned in the sea. I mean, the one, right, whether he got drowned in the sea or if he survived without getting drowned in the sea, then again, who's going to memorialize? Remember that time when I got made a total fool of by these people and their God? And when it comes down to writings on papyrus and stuff like that, one of the sources I looked at said it's not just that there are no records of these Hebrew people from that particular area in which they lived on papyrus. There are actually, in fact, no records left on papyrus from that particular area where they live. Zero historical writings on papyrus survive from that particular area in Egypt from this whole wide time frame. But mostly, again, because, history.
I always thought it was amazing, and of course, God's intervention, that, when the Israelites first came to Egypt, and it says, I think, there were like 70 of them, it mentions 70, and basically they were pretty well off, and Joseph was still alive, they were treated well and everything. And I would think most people would just get absorbed into the culture. I'm sure there were a lot of other peoples that Egypt conquered, brought them into their land, and they just became Egyptians, right? They just, especially if they were treated well, like the Israelites would have been, it would have been so easy for those people just to become Egyptians, right? Just to get absorbed into the culture. But God kept them separate, and they themselves had to keep their identity and their, who they were, God's people.
That's right. That's really been a hallmark of the Jewish people in the times and places, including all down through history to today, in which they have been, in small groups within foreign lands, an amazing ability to maintain an identity as a people, rather than to entirely assimilate. And we see that theme, right? And part of the answer to it right there with Joseph, right? That he says, remember that God is coming for us to take us back into the land. It is not our destiny to just become a part of this land. It is our destiny to remain who we are, descendants of Abraham, fulfilling the promises of God to Abraham in some other land.
Well, and Scott, on top of that, Pharaoh deliberately tried to separate them out.
Well,
They were deliberately separated out because they were slaves.
that certainly happens later on, but you see that even in the beginning too, right? Even in the Pharaoh who first brings Joseph in, he's here, settle in this land, slightly separate altogether as yourself, not, oh, come on, you guys can just assimilate here in the land. There was a separation in a positive sense at the beginning, which leads to a separation in a negative sense later on in the story. All right, so another brief comment about names. Since I was talking about names, this comes up a little bit later, but this whole idea of names. So many unknown people in this part of the story. Moses. Which we're going to look at in a minute. It's not impossible that it's talking about his mother if it's really a Jewish name, where the term Moses or Moshe, as it looks like in Hebrew, means to draw out of. But in the context, it looks like you're talking about the daughter of Pharaoh naming it, and why would she name him by Hebrew name? So people say, but the M-O-S-E, Mose or Mosa, is a common Egyptian name ending, which basically means son of or born from, usually with a prefix in front of it. So many of the pharaohs, we have a Tutmos, meaning son of Thoth, as we would normally call him, and we have Amos, son of the moon god, or born from the moon. We have Ramos, which is very similar even to one of the most famous pharaohs, Ramesses, which is also a derivation of the same name, the same root, if we go back to the Egyptian version, as Moses. His name is essentially Ra-Moses, if we want to look at it in terms of the Egyptian roots, which might be the reason for Moses' name. So one interesting speculation is that the daughter of Pharaoh named him something, some sort of god, Moses, maybe the river Moses, maybe the god of the river Moses, and that later on, when he, as we're told in the New Testament, declined to be thought of as the daughter of the Pharaoh, or the son of the daughter of the Pharaoh, chopped that part off and just went with the part that also linked in with the Hebrew, and then became the Hebrew name. Of course, it's also possible that, we know from the story that she immediately knew it was a Hebrew child. Maybe she purposely gave him the Hebrew name for being drawn out of all these things. All these things are possible. All right, let us continue in the story. We're in verse 22. Then Pharaoh commanded all of his people, right? So, in case we forgot, right? Let's try to subject them with all kinds of hard work, and they keep growing. We'll give them harder work, and they still keep growing. Okay, have the midwives surreptitiously, presumably, kill all of the newborn males, which, by the way, goes back to this issue of assimilating into the culture. Because what happens if you have females being born and no males? Then eventually all the women are going to have to marry Egyptians. Or either extinction because of no offspring, or the intermarrying with Egyptians, and therefore assimilation of the people. So it seems like really the goal here was not kill them all. It was assimilate them out of being their own people. Then, since the midwives wouldn't cooperate, And by the way, when it says God blessed them because they feared God and did not know as the king of Egypt commanded, I like to speculate, and some other people like to speculate, that perhaps part of God's immediate blessing on them for fearing God was that the Pharaoh didn't kill them for the ridiculous story about why they didn't kill the children. But anyway, turning to a new phase, he said, okay, I can't get the Hebrew midwives to do it, which we could probably have sold as, well, they just died in childbirth, right? Who else was there to say otherwise? That didn't work, so now verse 22. Then Pharaoh commanded all of his people, every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live. So now it's a little bit more dramatic. It's a little bit more out in the open. But the goal still seems to be the same thing. If we leave some females and no males, they must assimilate themselves out of existence as a special people. Chapter 2. Now a man from the house of Levi went and took as his wife a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she took for him a basket made of bulrushes and daubed it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it among the reeds by the riverbank. And his sister stood at a distance to know what would be done to him. Now the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, while her young women walked beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her servant woman, and she took it. And when she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby was crying. She took pity on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go." So the girl went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed him. I just want to reflect for a moment. Again, this whole idea with the names, how many opportunities there were there to actually tell us someone's name. When they just keep saying, the sister, the mother, the sister, the mother, the daughter of Pharaoh. Verse 10, when the child grew older, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses because, she said, I drew him out of the water. So, let us explore another good literary device, ironies, right? You wouldn't want to study a literary composition without thinking about its ironies, would you? So, what ironies do we see here in the story? Well, first one we've already noted, right? That the more the Hebrews are repressed, the more they're fruitful and multiply anyway. But here's another one we're only seeing the beginning of, but if you already know the story, you know this may be the best irony of them all. Pharaoh attempts to destroy God's people by throwing babies into the Nile, only to have God use a baby drawn from the Nile to destroy Pharaoh. So, the birth of Moses. From unnamed Levite parents, so far. We find out who they are later. In an ark. Many of you have probably heard this before. The word that's translated basket here is the same word that's translated ark throughout the entire story of Noah. And that particular word doesn't actually appear elsewhere in the Old Testament. It appears as a reference to what we call the Ark of Noah, and it appears here in reference to what we call the basket that Moses is in. But it's the same word. So he's got an ark. He's got an ark sealed with pitch, just like Noah. And he's going to be an instrument of God's deliverance, just like Noah.
What's the root definition of that word ark? Is there like a...
I didn't actually look at it in its historical linguistic context. I assume it's linked somehow to the concept of basket, since it's or container, since it's translated that way here. But I didn't really look it up. So, just to reflect, well, what do we know about Moses' birth? We know his parents are Levites. We know he has got an ark sealed with pitch, like Noah. We know he has an unnamed sister, and we know he's eventually going to be raised by an unnamed daughter of Pharaoh. I'll just make one more side note here. Some people like to make a lot of this issue, that there is another famous story from ancient Egypt, or the surrounding areas there, not necessarily right in Egypt, called the birth of Sargon. Now, Sargon was the son of was a prince of a land, but when he was born, for reasons not important to our story, he was put out in a basket by the river. And when he was put out in the basket in the river, he was found by another family. He was raised by another family, and then he grows to become a great leader. All of which follow a similar storyline to the life of Moses. Although, interestingly, his story is also the opposite of Moses' story, since he starts out born in a royal family and ends up raised by a gardener before he ends up in power anyway. So that story exists. In case you hear anyone say, well, we know that the story of Moses can't be true because all they did was just repeat the story of the birth of Sargon. Similarities from one story to another story don't remotely prove that one story was just made up to sound like the other story. It's equally plausible that leaving a baby in a basket by the Nile was a relatively commonplace thing in this time. It may have been the socially acceptable or almost socially acceptable way for a family to put a child out there that they didn't want or couldn't raise, that still have a chance to be taken by someone else, as you might say in an older context, like leaving a baby on the steps of the church to be taken in. Moses, as presumably we know, and linking in what we talked about the context in Genesis of types of Christ, Moses is one of the main and most important types of Christ in the Old Testament. We're not prepared to talk about the whole thing yet because he's still just a wee little baby here in Acts 1. But even right here in his birth story, what can we see that makes him a foreshadowing of Christ? What similarities do we already have just in the birth story context?
Evil king tried to kill all the boy babies.
Okay.
All boy babies.
Yeah, evil king tries to kill all the boy babies, which should have included him. Right, so we have that, and we have that in the story of the birth of Jesus. We have that in the story of the birth of Moses.
And who's from royal line.
We have a kind of a reflection there. It's a little bit different, right? Moses isn't born from a royal line, but will become a part of the royal line, or in the context of the royal line for part of his childhood. Of course, Christ was always part of the royal line, both in the spiritual and physical senses, in his birth.
Both spent time in Egypt growing.
Okay, both spent time in Egypt growing up, which is an interesting crossover in the story. There's a similarity there, and also another kind of inversion, right? In that Jesus was born outside of Egypt and then had to flee into Egypt, whereas Moses was born into Egypt and then had to flee out of Egypt later on. All of which comes in a wider context in which we can say that they both survive due to God's providence in arranging the circumstances that are going on with their birth. All right, here's some things. If you're following along my little guideline there, these are the things I've called miscellaneous points in the story. First, I like to mention this. I don't know. I just think it's a relatively common misperception of the story that Moses' basket is floating down the river. There's nothing here in the story that tells us his basket's floating down the river. His basket was placed in the reeds by the river. And then Miriam hung out there and waited until some people came by to that part of the river and saw him there. Which I think brings up a couple interesting questions. Miriam was there to watch. Was that on her own initiative, or was that by foresight of the mother? I just find it interesting because I've read a couple accounts now by a couple famous preachers, which each of one seems to assume the other, one of the other of those things is obviously true. One of them tells the entire story as if it's obviously true and something important about Miriam, that she took it upon herself to watch the child, whereas another preacher in his sermons on the thing took it as obviously true that this shows the faith of the mother in telling Miriam to watch because she fully expected God to provide and set her there to see it. Obviously, there's nothing in the text that actually tells us either way which way that goes.
Always wondered what the mother's expectation was for the baby. You know, like, obviously, she wasn't supposed to have the baby, right? It's supposed to have been thrown into the Nile when it was born. So she was defying the law by keeping him for 3 months, and then she puts him in the basket in the water. What she thought would, you know, did God tell her, you know, that he would be all right, or, you know, I've never heard this explanation where you said that, you know, that could be like leaving the baby on the steps of the church kind of thing, that was happening frequently, but, yes, for her just to say, well, okay, I always thought it was, you know, jig's up, I gotta get rid of this baby, instead of just throwing him in the river and letting him drown, I'm gonna at least give him a fighting chance by putting him in this basket, and,
Yeah, it's interesting to think about that, but I think that she thinks that there's a pretty good chance that someone's going to come by. I think overall, that's the context of the story. In fact, I think just to me it makes more sense that Miriam is there because her mother tells her, "Watch here. I'm going to put the baby here. You watch, and see what happens. Come and tell us, you know, how it works out." Because the other thing that we know about the story comes from the New Testament. Because in Hebrews 11:23 says this: "By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents because they saw that the child was beautiful and they were not afraid of the king's edict." Now, again, that doesn't tell us very much, but it provides us an insight that the general context in which we should see the parents is of faith. And then it makes sense to extend that not just to the keeping for 3 months, but to the putting in the basket as well, that there was the element there that God will provide by putting them there in the basket and setting Miriam there to watch. Yeah, we don't have that quite explicitly, but I think given the scraps that we have, that seems, I think, the most probable way of looking at the story. Again, certainly, the book of Hebrews wants us to think of the story as in terms of an element of faith there, in what's going on with the parents and Moses, not just desperation. Which again is interesting because the actual story of Exodus doesn't tell us that at all.
Scott, I just thought of another parallel in that they both were cared for by somebody named Mary or Miriam. The names are the same. Mary is Miriam.
Right. Yes. Exactly the same name, leading to the absurd confusions in the Quran.
What's that?
A famous absurdity in the Quran is there's the verse later on. When we actually find out the sister's name isn't until chapter 15, when she is introduced as Miriam, Aaron's sister. And the Quran includes that, but falsely, conflates that with Miriam, the mother of Jesus. And so there's a whole tradition of Islamic interpretation of why the Quran calls Mary, the mother of Jesus, the sister of Aaron. Instead of just because every third Hebrew child was always named Mary, apparently. Going all the way back to Egypt. All right, so next miscellaneous thing, although these things obviously are not miscellaneous. Pharaoh's daughter coming down to bathe right then at the time when there's a baby there in a basket. Is this also foresight of the mother? Or is it only God's providence? Well, it's God's providence either way, but is it just God's providence, or is it a providential working out of the mother's foresight? Did she know that this is a common place for the wealthy people to come and bathe, and that's why she put the basket there?
What I'm thinking is she kind of stalked it out during her pregnancy and stuff, saying, okay, she has to have a plan if it's a boy. And she sees this woman coming and bathing at the same time. And she says, okay, I'm going to put it, if I go in about this time, I can put him in the basket and she will see him.
Again, yeah, I think that's quite plausible. Whether it was a target to her or whether it was, this is the place the rich people come to bathe, or whether it's because I've seen specifically this daughter of Pharaoh come to bathe. It makes sense within the context of the story to have chosen the place to put the basket there. Again, especially if the whole idea is, I think if I put them here in the basket, he might survive. Then of course you're thinking about where of the million miles of the Nile that you want to place the basket. And again, it's obviously God's providence working out, but I don't think there's any reason not to think that this was part of the faithful foresight of the mother also, choosing a place to put the basket.
It's a beautiful baby, and that sort of ties in as well, that he would be attracted to.
That is an interesting element in the story. It's mentioned several different places that there's something striking about Moses as a baby, which helps lead the daughter of Pharaoh to want to take him in. The offer to get a Hebrew nurse, I wonder also, was that a spur of the moment thing on the part of Miriam, or was that also a part of the mother's plan? I just really wish we could know how deep the thoughts and the plans of the mother were. She sit down and plan this all out. Then Miriam was right there. Okay, look, here's the place where we need to put the basket. This is the people are always coming down in here, and it's the rich people that could take care of a child. You sit there and you watch, and then if someone gets and you have a chance, come offer to a nurse and come get me.
Do you know like the reasoning behind, or like not the reasoning behind, that's kind of violent, but like a reason that they would be so ambiguous with the wording and naming of the people and all of that, because you really don't get a lot more than just a really basic, here's the story that's happening. No embellishment of who these people are until later. So it's just interesting how you go, I wonder who that person is. Well, you don't know.
Well, I think part of the answer to that question is because it is written to be a dramatic story. Right? God created it to be a dramatic story, and Moses, in writing it down, is writing it as a dramatic story to catch your attention, to lead your thoughts in certain ways, to illustrate the important themes. It's intended to be the kind of thing that is studied and memorized and passed down to the people as a story that will catch your attention so that you can tell it and so that you can retell it and so the children will want to hear it so that we can not lose these important aspects of who we are as a people. That's very important, in an ancient society, right? The Hebrew society is going to be more literate than almost any other ancient society, but still, it's not a society where with printing and books and things, right? So whether without any scriptures yet, even all we have for the sake of identity is the stories that are passed down, and stories passed down better as stories than as dry recitations of facts.
Just a question on the Pharaoh's daughter, baby, was there some kind of custom that would have kept the crocodiles from not going where she's going? Did she pick that? There's just little subtleties that you don't know.
Well, obviously we can add that to the list of providences that the basket wasn't snapped up by a crocodile, but if you want, but I think mostly you just have to agree that if you're an Egyptian, you just have to take your chances. You're living by the Nile, all life is the Nile, and you might be eaten by a crocodile.
I think the Latin names help keep your focus. The point of the story is God's preservation and working through this particular child who gets named. So naming the others might distract you into, oh, well, I need to know this person's history or that person's history, or more about details about the side characters. And he's like, no, I'm the main character, and this is the person that I was working through, and that's what I want you to remember.
Exactly, right? That's what I mean by saying it's a story, right? It's pointing things out. It wants you to focus in certain ways, and therefore it's arranged that way to focus on the important things, to draw your attention along certain lines, so you can follow the themes of what's going on and not get distracted by the other details.
I have a question. It makes no sense that this princess would defy her father and save this Hebrew boy that's supposed to be drowned.
Well, I think that our best explanation there is that it's quite likely that this daughter had no interaction with the Pharaoh whatsoever, right? So we're talking about a harem culture here, like everywhere else, and so the fact that she's described as daughter of Pharaoh does not necessarily imply that she has any station whatsoever in court, and therefore, even later on, it doesn't imply that Moses has any station in court either, unlike the movie Prince of Egypt and all of that. There were likely dozens of daughters of Pharaoh living in harem towns, which may have never even met the Pharaoh.
Maybe even hundreds,
So in that sense, it wouldn't pose a problem for her at all. There's no likelihood that he's ever going to meet the Pharaoh. There's no likelihood that anyone living there in her context with her is going to want to turn her in. They're all going to have sympathy with her for that. So I think that's the best way of thinking about that.
I was also just gonna point out that that's also if she even agrees with, even if she knew this, even if she agreed with the idea of throwing all the children into the Nile, she could have very well disagreed with that. So why would she go along with it if she had a chance to not have to?
Well, right. I think the point behind the question was that she might have been afraid to be seen not going along with it. Not that she wouldn't have a natural inclination to reject killing of babies. I think we can agree that all young women would have a natural inclination to reject the concept of killing babies.
There was a problem with disagreeing with Pharaoh, though. If you disagree with Pharaoh, cut your head off.
Right. You don't want to be seen, but yeah, the point is you don't want to be seen publicly flaunting disobeying of the Pharaoh's orders. But again, I think that there is every reason to think that she would have been well insulated from any chance of that. At least it's very plausible that she would have been isolated from the Pharaoh. All right, we're running out of time here. One question was kind of addressed earlier, and I want to say a couple things about that, is the question, how faithful were the Hebrew people at this time? We're not really introduced to them a lot here in the opening act. We meet a couple of people, we don't get their names, we're not even really told about their faith. We have to hear that later on from the book of Hebrews, of all places. We get their names later on when we get genealogies and some things like that. But how faithful were the Hebrew people at the time? These midwives are presented as faithful, right? We get the later indication that Moses' parents were faithful. Someone taught Moses and Aaron and Miriam to be faithful at some point in the upbringing. But just as a counterpoint to that, we have some other things. Again, not in the story here, but later on. Let me just read you from Joshua chapter 24, verse 14. Now, therefore, fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and faithfulness. Put away the gods that your fathers served beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. Is an indictment on the people that came out of Egypt as being people who worshiped the idols of Egypt. And of course, we have the story of the golden calf, right? Which leads credence to the idea that there was a substantial portion of these people which were prone to idolatry that they learned in Egypt. And we have something similar in Ezekiel in chapter 20, verse 8. But they rebelled against me and were not willing to listen to me. None of them cast away the detestable things their eyes feasted on, nor did they forsake the idols of Egypt. So not only, therefore, do we know that a substantial portion of the people at this time of Moses did involve themselves in the idolatries of Egypt, but they took that with them out of Egypt, and it was a continual difficulty with the people that there was leftover idolatry from Egypt with them, even as they were proclaiming to be the people of God. So I guess all we can say is probably like always, there's faith and lack of faith, and often mixed together in the same person, no doubt. The ability to trust God in certain circumstances, and also the ability to foolishly engage in idolatry in another moment, or due to other stresses of life, all in the same person, no doubt. All right, let me just finish with this summary. What do we learn here about God? Obviously, God's sovereign power, His plan, His providence to make it come about. We should remember that in the midst of suffering, God is definitely at work. Not even always in spite of, but sometimes specifically in the suffering to bring about his plan. There's no obvious miracles in the story of the birth of Moses like there are in the rest of his life. But nonetheless, the quiet providence, you might say, instead of the dramatic miracle, which is just another way that God shows His faithfulness, and fortunately or unfortunately for us, depending on how you tend to look at these things, the continuous and prominent way in which God works out His plan, quietly in God's providence in all of the awkward things of our lives, rather than in dramatic and miraculous ways. You don't see miracles of God in your life? Why should you? What you should do is recognize that God's always at work in these circumstances of your life, even if no one writes a story about it so you can go back and look at it later. We still trust that this is true. We should trust that this is true. This should be part of our reflecting on and our acknowledgement of God and who He is that as this was going on in very specific ways that we find out about in Moses, whether we find out about them or not, these things are going on for all of us all of the time. God working in all of the aspects of life to bring about His plans and purposes. All right, so I stole 2 extra minutes of your time, sorry. Again, if you